Okay, show me a sign. And Claire Lisette. Today we're going to combine and do two chapters. So chapters 23 and 24 because they're pretty short. Okay? I really am glad to see that Mary is plotting. She's kind of finding a weakness there in Mr. Squints. Okay. Today, when I finished sweeping and emptying the chamber pots, Mrs. Muffins gestures for me to take off my apron and put on my cloak and hat. We're leaving the inn? Andrew has gone out this morning carrying his black satchel. He must not know because he would never approve. What will he do if he finds out? Mrs. Muffins doesn't tie my hands. Instead, she gives me a woven white oak basket to carry, and she carries a larger one. I follow her through the narrow streets covered in slush. My feet are blocks of ice. I wonder if I could find my way back to the wharf. Could I explain my predicament in pantomime to one of the sailors? Or to a lady or a gentleman? I pause in front of a large brick building, and I catch sight of my reflection in a window. Is that really me? I look like a vulgar beggar, and a deaf and dumb one at that. Remember, dumb means the inability to speak. It doesn't mean lack of intelligence, okay? If I desperately grabbed someone's coat sleeve, he would surely hand me a penny and shake me off. The streets are crowded. The air is crisp. I can see my breath like smoke. Mrs. Muffin's pace is brisk, and I hurry to keep up. The streets are littered with rotten food and feces. That's poop. Not just horse flops. I see a lone sparrow. How do birds find food and water in this brick landscape? And where do they build their nests? Abruptly, Mrs. Muffins puts her arm across my chest as a horse and cart fly around the corner. The horse bells remind me that Christmas is nearby on us, and Mama always made the holiday special for George and me. I can almost smell the fragrant pine boughs that George and Papa placed on the mantelpiece in our sitting room. Mrs. Muffins shakes me out of my thoughts. She points at our destination. Faneuil Hall. I know it from the pictures George has shown me. It's long, two-storied brick building with large windows facing north, south, east, and west. I look for the weather vane that Ezra Brewer once described to me, a golden grasshopper that sits on a large cupola, and I see it. Inside the hall are stands with men and women selling fish, meats, produce, and cloth. I watch them hawk their wares to passers-by. I can feel the hum of the large crowd around me as I'm pulled along. I watch person after person, and I try to make eye contact. Are they too busy to perceive my terrified stare? I'm desperate to see someone that I know from home. I wonder if Ezra Brewer knows any of these sailors. Very often the same sailors and traders go from the vineyard to Boston and back again, over and over. Might they be keeping an eye out for a girl described like me? I try not to raise my hopes. We stop at a fishmonger, and for a minute I forget where I am. A fishmonger is a fish seller. I turn to Mrs. Muffin, and I talk in signs. Her face reddens, and she quickly lowers my hands. The fishmonger looks at me like I'm half-witted. Am I? What if I can never again speak to someone in my own language? I fear I might go mad. Chapter 24. We carry the heavy baskets back through the busy streets. I have the peculiar sensation that I'm being followed. I slow my pace and glance behind me several times. I see a man turn his back to me. Further along, the same man ducks into a doorway. Ooh. I'm so weary that it may just be my imaginings. Jeremiah Skiff lives in Boston. Even though I'm not sure I can ever forgive him, I would run to embrace him if we passed on the street. It's odd how an antagonist back home could be a welcome friend elsewhere. I assist with Mrs. Muffins putting away the groceries and the buttery. Andrew isn't in the parlor or the kitchen. Is he in his room? Is Mr. Squints in his? Mrs. Muffins throws feed to the hens in the yard. I notice that she's left her ledger unattended on the table. I'm guessing a ledger is like a like a book that keeps track of information and money and things like that. While she had her back turned, I hastily cover it with a basket of dirty laundry. If I could tear out a page without being noticed, I could write a note to Mr. Squints. I need to find a quill. Quill is a fancy old feathery pen. And before I can scheme, I am pulled roughly toward the hearth and handed a bucket. Mrs. Muffins points to the kettle. She wants me to fetch water from the pump in the yard to stretch the oyster soup for another meal. The laundry basket is still covering the ledger, but for how long? Mrs. Muffins will want to list our purchases. In the yard, the hens crowd me. I bet she's stingy in feeding them, too. And does she ever clean up their droppings? I'm surprised she hasn't had me do it. Their feet, now and mine, are covered in waste. There's a high fence, in which the fowl and I would find it challenging to escape. Re-entering the kitchen with a heavy bucket of water, I can see the laundry basket is still on the table, but Mrs. Muffins is nowhere in sight. I'm certain she's gone searching for her ledger. I must make haste. I carefully rip a page from the back of the ledger. I guess a ledger is a notebook. Yeah. I carefully rip a page from the back of the ledger. I discover that her true name is Martha Cummings. I see no quill. So I take a splinter of charred wood from the kitchen fire and steady my shaking hands as I begin to write. It's messy, and the words smudge badly. I'm too occupied to notice vibrations, and my heart leaps out of my chest when Mrs. Muffins is suddenly behind me. She tries to snatch the paper from me. The note is not finished, but hopefully Mr. Squints will understand my plea. Kidnapped. Please help me home. Get home to... I don't know where I find the strength, but I jab her stomach sharply with my elbow, and I'm off. I make it out of the kitchen, into the stair landing before she sits upon me. I open my mouth to howl, and I try as hard as I can, but I can only huff. Mrs. Muffins grabs the note, and she leaves me lying on the landing. I scramble down the stairs, hoping to wrestle the note from her hands and finish my task. I enter the kitchen too late. With a crooked smile, she crumples the note and throws it into the fire. She's talking, clapping, signaling for me to make haste and get supper ready, but all I can do is watch that piece of paper curl and burn in the flames. Andrew must have come home because she rushes toward the parlor, gesturing vividly. I follow her, throwing up my hands, begging her to stop, but she ignores me. In the parlor, Andrew is frozen as he listens, his eyes narrowing on me. When Mrs. Muffins leaves, he grabs my arm and shakes me. His teeth are clenched as he talks. Spittle lands on my cheek. I wipe it away. He throws me down onto the rug, and I'm too frightened to move. I gather enough courage to raise my eyes and see him furiously scribbling on a piece of paper. He flings it in my face, and he waits with a tapping foot for me to retrieve it. He has written, "Remember the rules." He drags me down to the servants' quarter. I fear he and Mrs. Muffins will never let me out of this cramped room again. I pound the bed with my fists. That night I lie awake and I cry cold tears. Mr. Squints must be curious why I didn't serve supper. I wonder what story they will make up and if he believes it. I pray, "Dear Lord, why have you brought me to this place? No matter how much I suffer and my faith is tested, I will never stop trying to get back to my family and friends. I've learned too much too fast about how the world treats anyone who's different. I have to learn their rules if I'm going to beat them." If Nancy were with me, would her outlook change? Would she be bolder with her father and less prejudiced toward freed men in the Wampanoag? The world is bigger than we ever imagined. I spend the next morning pacing back and forth on the tiny rug. My mind is frantic, like a rat in a trap. How will I ever get home? In the afternoon, Mrs. Muffins unlocks the door. She drags me up to the kitchen and she gestures for me to take tea to Andrew into the parlor. What is going on? As I approach with the tray, I see another man standing in the entryway. Mrs. Muffins comes in and reaches out her hand, which the stranger takes, and she pours them each a cup of tea and offers them popovers. The man has broad shoulders and long legs, and he wears a suit rather than a coat and breeches. His graying dark hair is smartly slicked back, and he walks around me, obviously disgusted by my feral state. And he's surprised that I don't, and I'm surprised he doesn't hold his nose. But he doesn't dismiss me outright. His hawk-like eyes are brown with gold flecks, and they're fixated on me with great curiosity. Could this be the man who wrote the letter to Andrew? When Mrs. Muffins brings my coat and hat, I cling to her. Does this man intend to take me away? As Amen had said, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I moan as Andrew pulls me away from her, and before I can resist, the older gentleman sweeps me out the door and into a stately carriage. This book is intense, and I love it.